Christ, our offense counselor. As Jesus was preparing to send out the 12, he told them in Matthew 10:24 and 25, "The disciple is not above his master, nor the servant above his Lord. It is enough for the disciple that he be as his master, and the servant as his Lord." Since these words were from Jesus himself, we would do well to pay them heed and study how Jesus dealt with offenses and then proceed in a similar manner. When Jesus was offended, how did he react? When Jesus witnessed offenses taking place, what did he do? When Jesus was caught between the offenses of others, how did he respond? Knowing the answers to these questions will greatly benefit us and those with whom we interact. But only if we receive the knowledge Jesus was trying to impart by his own actions and then allow the Spirit control of our lives so we can respond appropriately as well. Knowing the truth is good, but it's not enough. We need to put the truth into action in our lives in order for it to be effective. The account we're about to discuss is one of many which were recorded in the life of Jesus concerning offenses and how he dealt with them. Jesus dealt with many offenses during his ministry, and this account involves many facets of offense that all interact simultaneously. How does Jesus deal with such a complex situation? In the majority of offenses, it seems that there's one offender and one offended. But in this situation, it's a very complex mix of offenses and who is offended and how those offenses take place. In the commentary, as we previously noted in our lessons considering the offense involving Joseph and his brothers, family relationships can be the most complicated of relationships. Hopefully, none of us will ever face an offense within our families like that of Joseph and his brothers. Still, family offenses can be the most stressful that one ever faces. The lives of family members are so intertwined. Every event, every situation that affects one will so often affect the other family members. One can quickly be pulled into or caught up by complicated problems with little knowledge or insight as to the underlying conflicts and misunderstandings that are actually driving the problem. Family members are directly affected by how their families are affected. That is, the difficulty is not driven by the actual events, not only driven by the actual events, but also by how others are responding to them and are affected by them. Feelings and emotions can become blurred and blended together. This general situation wherein a personal offense occurs often can expand to become a family-wide offense. This is true of both our natural and our spiritual families. Many people often will say that they feel closer to their church families than to their natural families, especially when those family members do not share their religious beliefs. With that general background regarding families in mind, we will now take a close look at the Scripture at one such family's difficulty, the family of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. The golden truth. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. Luke 10 and 40. Any comments on this introductory section here?
There's so much just in that one introduction.
Yeah, there is.
Just talking about family offenses in general. I feel like it's a current, I guess, an ongoing tactic of the devil to decrease the value of family.
Mm-hmm.
And to get to the point where, when a family member offends you, they're supposed to be the ones that, you're going to love no matter what, and you're going to be able to say, well, I'm sure they didn't mean it that way. But when the devil comes in, that's not the attitude you have. It's, well, this is the one person who should have never hurt me, but they did, and
Right.
I don't really need them. That's the spirit I never thought that I would see in my own family.
Right, right.
But unfortunately, I believe probably every one of us has experienced that in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely a spirit that of division that,
Mm-hmm.
that the devil is putting even in our own families, let alone the church family.
Right. I think you really hit the nail on the head there with that understanding. The devil is intent on bringing division wherever he can. Now, it's one thing when people who set up divisions against themselves are divided. It's no big surprise when we see Republicans divided against Democrats. That's no big deal. We expect to see those kinds of divisions. It's no big deal when we see white supremacists and the African American organizations coming against one another. That's no big surprise. We expect to see those divisions. Certainly those were inspired by the enemy of our souls as well. But the devil is not content bringing division where there's already division. His greatest desire, his greatest hope, his goal is to cause division where there should be none. And certainly families, being the basic building block of human existence, seems like an excellent place to start division. Yes?
I don't know what it has to do with anything, but while you were reading that, it took me back to, I think it was the part about complex issues between families.
Yeah.
It took me back to when I would hear Sonny, our stepfather,
Mhm.
yelling at Mom.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times it made me cry.
Yeah.
And I didn't really understand that
Mm-hmm.
because it wasn't hurting me.
Right. But it was.
It was.
It was.
That just made me think of complex.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that is absolutely a big part of the complex nature of the enemy's desire to cause division where there should be none. Yes.
First of all, I want to say, thankfully in the Bible there are situations like Joseph and Mary and Martha, so we'll know that there was conflict even in family there.
Absolutely.
And they say sometimes you hurt the one you love the most.
Mm-hmm.
So sadly, there's conflict probably in your immediate family first.
Right.
Because y'all are so close knit, you and I,
Mm-hmm.
we have, and we're pretty close to everything being similar, but we're on our own person.
Mm-hmm.
And then as Brother Nick was saying, conflict can arise and it can affect the whole family.
Absolutely.
You see so many times when parents, like he was saying, fight and it affects the family and sometimes for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that even with my own family, things that we've experienced, it goes on and on and on. So we have to be very careful, especially, I would say with little kids that we have in the home, but also even our siblings as they grow older.
Absolutely.
Those things affect us also when we see, our sibling into trouble, or if we saw our sibling go to jail, or that affects us,
Mm-hmm.
And could eventually, the devil uses everything, like
Absolutely.
we said before. So it could be like a sibling go to jail, or a sibling be, hospitalized for whatever. And that affects you constantly, but that inner conflict also, the devil's wanting to destroy that, and then he brings it also into the local church body.
Right.
Whereas you've got all of these other conflicts in family and dealing with, and then you all come here,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's...
Absolutely. And this is something that we need to be made aware of. We need to understand that, number one, when it comes to division, there's not a human on the face of this earth who's my enemy or your enemy. Right. Not one. Certainly not in our families. Never. But even outside. There is not another human on the face of this earth, Republican, Democrat, they're not enemies. But the enemy of our souls, our common enemy, has set us one against another in many different ways. And that's his, once again, that's his greatest desire. And when we recognize that, it makes it much easier for us to see conflict for what it is. It's not me against you. It's not Southside against Zion Hill. It's not Republicans against Democrats, blacks against white. It's not Muslims against Christians. It's the enemy of our souls who has entered in among us to try to bring division. And when we recognize that fact, it makes seeing how Jesus handled division, how Jesus handled offenses, much easier to comprehend. Because there should be no division among humanity. It was never God's desire for there to be division among humanity. It was always God's desire for there to be unity among us, unity in His will, for His glory and for our benefit. I've said it so many times in the past, talking about a small child. You tell a small child not to do something, and that's the first thing they want to do. Why? That's what they're asking. Why can't I do this? Why? And so we see that this human nature that we have is it's the place where the enemy uses the truth to bring division. Why? That is the most divisive question in the world. And I feel certain that the enemy of our souls is the one who invented the word why.
I think it's important for us to remember too, the ultimate goal of the devil is to destroy the kingdom of God.
Right.
He doesn't care how he has it. And it's not just the church of God.
Right.
The kingdom.
The kingdom. Absolutely.
He doesn't want to see one soul saved.
Right.
And when you think about it like that, we've often heard the term or the cliche, if a family can't stay together, what can anybody do?
Right.
That's a biblical principle.
Yes.
Jesus said in Matthew, a kingdom
Divided against itself
will be brought to desolation, and a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Right.
That is the goal of the enemy, is
Absolutely.
to divide us against one another. And why wouldn't the enemy bring that inside
Absolutely.
of the kingdom first and foremost? If that's his target, if that's who he's trying to destroy, why would he not first and foremost and strongest bring that attack inside of the four walls of the church?
I've heard it said, if you don't feel like you have any problem with the enemy, it's because he has you in his pocket.
Right.
You're completely under his control. We'll get into this lesson just a little bit here, see if we can see how Jesus dealt with this division, this conflict resolution here. Introducing the family, part 1, Luke 10:38. Now it came to pass as they went that he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. Now this family lived in the village of Bethany, less than 2 miles from Jerusalem on the eastern downward slope of the Mount of Olives. The family is mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. Located just outside Jerusalem, their home provided a natural retreat for the Lord to periodically get away for brief rests. As suggested by Bible scholars such as Albert Barnes and John Gill, Martha seems to be the mistress or head of the house, and her brother Lazarus and younger sister Mary lived with her. She thus naturally would have had the care of the household and otherwise oversee operations around their home. Now, one thing that modern readers often overlook in this account is the fact that women were rarely considered the head of a household in Bible times. This didn't happen. This was unheard of. Even if Lazarus was Martha's younger brother, as the firstborn male, he would have naturally been the head of household in this situation. Yet we read that in the Scripture that Martha received Jesus into her house. Her house. Martha may have been a widow in the home of her late husband, or Lazarus could have been an unhealthy man with a long-term illness that kept him from fulfilling that role, which he relinquished to his sister Martha. Whatever the reason, the situation was unusual to say the least. There are many similar unusual situations in the New Testament that we don't recognize because we are looking at them from modern eyes. But when we look at them through the eyes of the people who were involved in the situation, this would have been a very unusual family situation. The wealth of the family is made clear by their ability to host such a party. Jesus, his disciples, and likely others from the community would have been in attendance. This was no small gathering. We also know that shortly after this visit, that Lazarus, their brother, would die. The same Lazarus that Christ later raised from the dead. This is also the same Mary who later, following the resurrection of Lazarus, would anoint the Master's feet with costly ointment. Any thoughts there? Part 2, the Master's visit. The family undoubtedly looked forward to Christ's visit with great expectation. As mistress of the house, Martha desired to prepare the best hospitality she could for the Master and his disciples. John Gill's exposition of the entire Bible suggests that Martha was a person of substance who had servants to wait on tables. Luke 10:39, and she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. While Martha, as customary for her, was busily involved with her oversight in the kitchen and meal preparation, her sister Mary had gravitated into the room where the Master was conversing. We're not told who or how many were gathered there with Christ and his disciples. At the Master's feet was customarily the place that a disciple would sit. This gathering of disciples in Martha's home is similar to a later occasion described by John. They made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. John 12:2. Now each individual had their place and responsibility, and everyone was surely eager to hear what this man who had stirred up such controversy would have to say on this occasion. Perhaps some were still undecided as to who Jesus was. Maybe the topic of his message had been advertised. Whatever was discussed, it was only for those who were in attendance, since none of the words of this message were actually recorded on this occasion. Sometimes the subject of the sermon is of far less importance than the breakthroughs that result in spite of the subject. This was clearly such an event. The lesson learned is of far more spiritual importance than what those were there in attendance heard on that day. Any thoughts here?
I'm just curious where John Gill gets the idea that Martha had servants to wait on tables. Any idea?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just the text. The fact that there were a bunch of people at the house, she wouldn't have been the only one. To have that many, in this society, if someone was going to set up such a event, they wouldn't do so on their own. It would have required more than the two who were there. Now, if Martha was the only one who was taking care of everything, she had a lot of work on her hands. I mean, just simply to care for the 13, because there would have been at least 16 total there if you only count the disciples, Jesus, and the family. So, I mean, I don't know if you've ever actually set up a party for 16 people. That's a pretty big event. And if you figure there were at least some other people from the village, that would have been quite an affair to put on single-handedly, so to speak. So chances are good, I'm sure that at least plays a part in John Gill's estimation of her being having servants who could help take care of the situation. Anything else? Part 3, the offenses. The stage is now set for us to consider the next 3 verses. These are the heart of the matter. We shall identify the offenders and the offended in this account. There are three primary people offended by the bystanders or other guests who also could have been offended. We shall examine how and why the Master Counselor Jesus Christ so chose to address these offenses. And we shall consider the outcome, how that each party ultimately played an important part in achieving reconciliation among the others. Luke 10:40. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. Tell her to help. We find here three people were certainly offended. Martha is the first to declare that she was offended. Obviously, Martha was upset with her sister Mary. My sister hath left me to serve alone. Martha also was upset at the Master. Lord, dost thou not care? The other two offended were Christ and Mary, each offended by what Martha had just said about Mary and to the Master. Mary had just been called lazy, unconcerned about serious matters, and preoccupied with her own interests. Also, Martha had just suggested to Christ with her question that he didn't care. The first thing we need to understand is that this was done in front of the attending guests at this gathering. Martha didn't pull Jesus aside before or after his teaching, but during. She interrupted him to air her complaint. Her first and foremost accusation was against Jesus himself. And her problem was that she was so busy doing what she thought to be service for Christ that she lost sight of the importance of being willing to receive from Christ. As the author of this lesson stated, Martha likely had servants who could have fully taken care of all the household needs and preparations. It was frustrating for her to see her sister just sitting there when she was working so hard. Now, I really never saw this until I studied it out, but this has clear ties to many who serve God today. Sometimes we can get so bogged down in doing things for God in the service that we fail to sit down and receive from Him. We all need the strength we can receive from Him when we allow ourselves to be still and know that He's God. Second, she was offended by her sister's apparent lack of concern as well. This is exactly how the enemy of our souls works today. He reminds us of our own hard work while pointing out others who seem to be blessed, though they're not putting forth the same kind of effort that we are. Martha had lost focus on Christ and began to focus on her own labor for Him. This always has a tendency to hinder our ability to receive good things from God. A story was told, I think, Sister Betty Marlowe has some of the best stories. A woman was cleaning the church. The problem was this was supposed to be a cleaning day, and everybody was supposed to come and help. Well, it turns out everybody couldn't. They were busy. They had things that were keeping them from being there. So this one woman was there cleaning, and the more she cleaned, the madder she got. I'm working so hard, and nobody else is here, and I'm having to do all this by myself. And she missed out on a huge blessing because she was unable to see that she had the ability to do what others were unable to do. What could have been a blessing for her ended up being a curse to her. We need to understand that sometimes our responsibilities are unpleasant. Sometimes we may get bogged down. But we also need to remember that the only way to receive the strength we need to continue is by spending time with Jesus. And if all we do is work, if all we do is labor for the Lord, we're going to wear ourselves out. It's important that we work for the Lord. It's important that we fulfill our responsibilities, whatever they may be, our specific individuals' responsibilities. As I said, each one in this account had responsibilities that they were to take care of. But it's also important that we set aside that time to spend with God for that refreshing, to remind us of why we're doing the work, to give us the encouragement that whatever we may feel, we're not alone. Whatever we may be experiencing right now, we're probably not the only ones to experience it. And we need the strength to continue on that can only be found by sitting at Jesus' feet, by that time we spend alone with Him. It's critical for our spiritual survival. I mean, we see Martha here on the verge of spiritual destruction, basically. She's accusing Jesus of not caring rather than receiving the good that He has for her, that He wants for her to have. So it's important that we work, but it's also important that we understand when it's time to put the work aside and allow Christ to restore what we've put out in our labors. It's no different than if we are working. There have been jobs that I've had that are very physically oriented, and during those times I've had to eat considerably more than I had to when I was working a desk job. I'm working physically I'm putting more strenuous effort in the work that I'm doing than sitting at a keyboard and moving a mouse. It burns more calories. That requires me to eat more. And so spiritually, there's no difference. You have to have the fuel to do the work. If I said, well, I'm just not going to eat anything because I'm too busy, and I'm working in the yard, digging ditches, doing some kind of strenuous labor, I'm just not going to eat. What's going to happen? Best case scenario, I'm going to be wore out. Worst case scenario, I just have a heat stroke and die. Spiritually, it's no different. We are under fire of the enemy all the time, and we require the fuel. And the harder we are working for the Lord, the more fuel we require spiritually. We need to be able to recognize when it's time, and we looking in on this situation can clearly see that Martha needed to sit down and receive some good fuel, some good spiritual strength from the Lord. But she didn't see that because the enemy had her focus elsewhere. Any comments?
Made me think of, I've never, in reading this passage before, considered the fact that there were other people there.
Yeah.
Because the only people I saw were the 4 people.
Yeah.
But in the lesson, it mentions the bystanders
Mm-hmm.
that also could have been offended.
Mm-hmm.
When we see something happen, when we hear someone say something offensive,
Mm-hmm.
we tend to take sides.
Absolutely.
There may have been those who
It's a division.
didn't know Jesus,
Right.
didn't know who He was, who were just curious to see
Yeah.
what was going
Absolutely.
on. They could have been turned away from Him
Mm-hmm.
because they thought, well, she is working hard. She
Yeah.
does need it. Right?
Why isn't he doing anything?
Right.
Absolutely. And that's something that we all need to consider in our own lives, how those around may be viewing the situation. That's why it's so critical then that when we are out in public, we recognize that we represent Jesus wherever we are, and how we respond to situations, how we deal with issues in public is how others see Jesus. And sadly, that's why the kingdom has such a bad reputation, not only in this country, but in the world. Because those who claim Christ, those who wear the t-shirts, have the bumper stickers, they don't necessarily look at how Jesus handled situations and then do similarly. Instead, they listen to the enemy and destroy themselves. And but the ways thereof are the ways of death, lead unto death. Anything else?
We jump to our own feelings on the issue before considering the spiritual aspect.
Right. Christ, the offense counselor, part 4. Martha's question to the Master suggests that she was overwhelmed in the kitchen and was frustrated that no one else noticed that she needed help. However, as we have considered in previous lessons regarding other supposed offenses, the true matter of her distress ran much deeper. One more time, we see the Master offense counselor bypass the apparent problem to address the true problem that ran much deeper. Christ never directly responded to or addressed Martha's question regarding her needing help in the kitchen. That was not what really troubled Martha that day. Luke 10:41, and Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things. Instead, first Christ disarmed her. He disarmed her hurt with his tender Martha, Martha. Then he turned her attention to the heart of the matter. Thou art careful and troubled about many things. He made it clear to her, 1, that he did indeed care, and 2, he understood what she had not been able to openly express. Those deeper issues that troubled her now. What we need to see first, as Jesus dealt with Martha's offense, is that he never condemned her for her hurt feelings. Jesus never condemned Martha. He never said, you made a bad choice. He never said, how could you feel like this? Don't you know who I am? He never condemned her because her feelings were hurt. Her offense was real. This was serious. She was truly hurt by the situation. Although it was never anyone's intention to hurt Martha or come against her, the pain that she was enduring was genuine. Spiritually, she was in need of the restoration that only Jesus could provide. And when she made her complaint to him, he recognized the enemy as the instigator and spoke peace to the situation. Working for God is important, but it's never God's will that the work we do should destroy us. When we deal with those who have been offended, accusations only intensify the damage and increase the pain. Jesus may have been speaking to Martha, but he was teaching all of us a lesson in his response to this spiritual injury, because she was spiritually injured. How we deal with hurting souls is a life and death decision. Looking to Jesus will always bring about a proper response. We're not told, and the others present probably never realized what was truly troubling Martha that day. But Christ knew, and his answers convinced her that he did. In hindsight, we know that Lazarus shortly would die. Was he already experiencing symptoms that troubled her, but with nothing definite to identify that he was ill? Now, as I've already mentioned in the introduction, Lazarus could have had a long-term illness or condition that hindered him from fulfilling his role as head of household. What that issue was is not recorded, or the fact that he had an issue was not recorded, But the implication is clear that this was a unique situation with a woman as head of the house in a male-dominated society. The point here was that Christ was saying, I see your hurt. I see your pain. Sometimes when we minister to those who have been offended, simply letting them know that we care and understand is sufficient. Sometimes that's all people need, is to know that we see their hurt, to let them know that we understand, and oftentimes we can sympathize with the situation because we may have experienced something similar. Luke 10:42, but one thing is needful, Jesus continuing, and Mary hath chosen that good part which shall not be taken away from her. At the moment, Mary was seated at Jesus' feet. She well may have shared some of the fears and concerns that were now troubling Martha. If Mary could find comfort and assurance at Jesus' feet, couldn't Martha also? No, he didn't openly or directly invite her to join them, but the implied invitation here is clear. The Master thus has indirectly invited Martha to join them. Now, in this country, many seem to have what's called a scarcity mindset. That is to say that whatever good there is will not be sufficient for everyone to receive enough. That means if someone else has something good, then we can't have the same thing. If they have something good, then I can't. This is the mindset that brought about, that instigated the first murder. God never condemned Cain for his sacrifice, just as Jesus never condemned Martha for her concern. God never condemns Cain for his sacrifice. The Bible only says that he preferred Abel's sacrifice. Genesis 4, 6, and 7, we read, and the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Just as Jesus never condemned Martha, so we see similar language here in Genesis. God assured Cain that the blessings that he had to offer were sufficient for all. Just because Abel had been blessed didn't mean that he couldn't be blessed. He reminded Cain of the dangers of sin, and he reminded Cain of his ability to triumph over it if he so choose. Thou shalt rule over him, speaking of sin. We don't need, God's blessings are sufficient for all. We don't need to worry ourselves if someone else is being blessed, as if their blessing will take away from ours. Jesus was reminding Martha of this same truth. Working in service to God is good, but sometimes it's far more important just to receive from Him. There will always be time to work for God, but if we don't spend sufficient time receiving strength from His Word in our prayer closets, we will not have the spiritual energy when the time does come for us to work for Him. We may fail God by not gleaning sufficient strength from Him, but He will never fail to supply for every need when we look to Him as we should. As I said with the analogy with food earlier, there's nothing in our lives that forces us to go into the kitchen or drive to a restaurant and get food. Nothing. That hunger in our stomachs may compel us, but we're not required. We can refuse. We can ignore that rumbling, that grumbling in our stomachs. Some have starved themselves to death because they chose to ignore that grumbling in their stomachs. They chose not to feed themselves enough. The entire line of medicine devoted to helping people in these respects. It's possible to die from lack of food in a world, in a country, in a society where it's always right at our fingertips. And spiritually, there's no difference. There's nothing that forces us into a prayer closet, forces us into a church building, forces us to read our Bibles. But we need the strength that can only come from God to get through every day. We need the sustenance that He has for us. As we've already noted, Martha is believed to have had others to help in the kitchen. What could prevent her from accepting this invitation? There was another offended party in the room. Martha had just said fairly harsh things about her sister Mary. Mary already was there at the feet of Jesus. What would Mary do? Would she give Martha a look that yelled out, "Mind your own business"? As her sister living with her, perhaps Mary knew at least some of the reasons that Martha was currently careful and troubled about many things. Excuse me. We could imagine the look that she gave to Martha was one of, "Come, you need this too." Having spent that time with Jesus, I think this is how she would have responded. And it's how we will respond as well when we take the time to hear from God and receive the example that He left for us in Jesus. Jesus wants the best for His children, all of us. There are none that He leaves out. We think about those, many have pointed out, and different things. I think Sister Wendy was talking about those who may have siblings who are in jail or had some other serious issue that's come against them. There are some who kind of set them aside. But we need to understand that it's as family members, as church family members, it's our responsibility to lift one another up. I think that's the most important thing that we can glean from this account is how Jesus dealt with the situation. He told Mary that she was wrong. But the way He did it was with concern, with compassion, with love. And just like God did with Cain, He reminded her, there's a better way. And I've given you the ability to overcome this situation as well. Each of us have been granted a choice. Each of us have been granted the opportunity to choose our destruction or our success. It's up to us. Someone else who's being blessed right now, that doesn't take away what God has for me. If someone else is receiving good, if someone else is wealthy right now and I'm not, that doesn't take away what God has for me. And the sooner we understand that, the sooner we can begin to grow in the Lord and be a blessing, be blessings one to another, and encourage one another and lift up one another as Jesus did here in this situation. Martha had the opportunity to take this wrong. We don't know how. I'm pretty sure that the Scripture doesn't go into her response. And I think that's intentional, because it's up to us to choose how we respond to the words of Jesus. Personally, I'd love to think that Martha said, I've been so busy, I forgot about how important it is to receive. That'll take care of itself. If there's nobody else to help, I remember it wasn't long ago that Jesus broke bread and fish and fed 5,000 people. If He needs to, He can do it again. I'm going to sit down and get what I need. We don't know. We're not told. And I think the importance of understanding how she responded is left up to us. How do we respond? How do we respond? The conclusion. Any questions, comments before I read the conclusion here? Thoughts?
As I was reading this week, the thought just came to my mind: how many times that I can say I felt much like Martha did
Mm-hmm.
in that moment.
Oh, absolutely.
Nobody's here to help me. You've
Absolutely.
left me all alone to do all this work. Why is nobody helping me? Why don't you care enough to send anybody
Right.
to help me? And it just kind of, I guess, made all the pieces kind of fall together in my mind as well. That if I look back on those times, I can look back and see, just as Jesus told Martha in that time, that was a small thing.
Yeah.
There were so many other things weighing on me in that moment that
Right.
I was dealing with and trying to go through and work through. And I think many times if we'll evaluate the situations we're in, I think it's common for each and every one of us to say there's times in our lives that we look around and say, Lord, why am I the only one?
Yep.
Why am I the only one doing this or working or laboring for you? But I think in those moments it's important for us to go back and evaluate our own lives and say, what really is going on in my heart that this is coming, because that's not the first attack of the enemy.
Right.
That's the icing on the cake, so to speak.
Right.
And we've got to go back to, Lord, what is really weighing on me so much that this is where I've gotten to. Help me where I am now. Help me through this trial and these struggles that I'm facing.
That makes me think of Elijah. And when he was hiding in the cave, pretty sure he was hiding from Jezebel at the time. Could be wrong. God said, "What are you doing here?" He had just saw to the execution of 850 pagan prophets, and one woman says, "I'm going to get you," and he runs away into the desert. And God asks him, "What are you doing here?" And I've been working so hard for you, God. I've been doing everything for you, God, but I'm the only one left who's serving you like I'm supposed to. And God asks him again, "What are you doing here?" "I told you, I'm the only one in the world who serves you right now. I've got to keep myself alive. I'm the only one left." Same kind of situation. God doesn't address his concern. He says, "Get back to work. I have 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed down to Baal or kissed his image. 7,000. You're not the only one. Get back to work." And at that moment, that's what he needed. That's what he needed to hear. That's the word he needed to hear from God. You're not alone. And so many times, that's the word we need to hear. You're not alone. You're not alone. Lord willing, there's far more than 7,000 who are serving God faithfully today. We're not the only ones who are struggling in our service to God. We're not the only ones who are fighting what seems to be an unwinnable battle. But so often we can allow our focus to be lost. And it's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants us to be so busy that we can't see our need for God. And if he can do that, he can destroy us one by one. I'm not going to read the conclusion. Go ahead and turn it over here in just a minute. Are there any closing comments, thoughts before I